Look at this document. In 1871, a Berlin office used orders like this to dictate which language children in village schools were allowed to learn. It was a top-down, legally binding mandate. That single administrative decree forms the entire plot of Alphonse Daudet's famous story, The Last Lesson. It dictated the daily reality for thousands of living children. To understand why a government hundreds of miles away was suddenly policing a village classroom, we have to look away from the schoolhouse. We have to look at a seemingly unrelated diplomatic quarrel over who would inherit the vacant throne of Spain. At the time, Otto von Bismarck ran Prussia. He had successfully pulled the northern German states into a single confederation, and he wanted the southern ones, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse, to join as well. The problem was, the southern states refused to join on their own. Bismarck operated in a strategic vacuum. He needed a massive external threat to force their compliance. He calculated that engineering a war with France was the only viable mechanism to trigger the wave of patriotic feeling required to unite them into a new German empire. Bismarck found his bait in the Spanish succession. A relative of the Prussian king was offered the Spanish crown, and France fiercely objected to the idea of being surrounded by the same royal family on two sides. The Prussian king politely refused the candidacy and telegraphed an account of the meeting to Bismarck. But as this visualization of the telegram shows, Bismarck maliciously edited the text before releasing it to the newspapers. He deleted specific portions so that both the French demands and the Prussian refusals read as calculated insults. The edited message, known as the Ems Dispatch, achieved its exact purpose. A furious France took the bait and declared war 6 days later, in July 1870. The military readiness of the two nations offered a harsh contrast. While France had almost no system for feeding or moving its men, Prussia moved its army seamlessly using railway timetables drawn up years in advance by its staff. The ensuing war lasted 10 months, but the French Empire lasted only 60 days of it. Massive logistical failures led to a rapid collapse. By September 1st, at Sedan, roughly 100,000 French soldiers surrendered. This included Emperor Napoleon III himself, seen here in his military uniform, marking the absolute defeat of his empire. The immediate geopolitical victory for Prussia was profound. As you can see in this photograph of the opulent Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the German Empire was officially proclaimed right inside the historic seat of French royal power. Bismarck's diplomatic trap had worked perfectly. He had manufactured a war and completely rewritten the balance of power in Europe. The punishing terms of the peace were formalized in the Treaty of Frankfurt. As this map of the 1871 border shows, administered directly by the centralized government in Berlin. Berlin justified this annexation on historical and linguistic grounds, asserting that Alsace had belonged to the Holy Roman Empire and that Alsatian is a Germanic dialect. This brings us back to the classroom. Inside this newly annexed zone, the administration executed its new decree. Teachers who could not instruct in German were summarily dismissed, and replacements were imported from other parts of Germany. In the dialect-speaking districts, French was systematically cut back and then entirely eliminated, completing the transition from a military conquest to total cultural assimilation. Alphonse Daudet, whose intense gaze we see in this portrait, served in the French National Guard during the war. He wrote The Last Lesson precisely 2 years after the defeat, speaking directly to a humiliated, mourning readership. Monsieur Hamel losing his 40-year career by a written order from Berlin was a reported fact. It was the calculated final step in consolidating a newly forged empire. Yet there is a historical irony underneath this that classroom notes usually leave out. Franz's family in the story almost certainly spoke Alsatian at home, not French. When Monsieur Hamel and his students mourn the loss of French, they are mourning the language of the state and the school, rather than their native mother tongue. The harder historical reality is that the French Republic had been deliberately suppressing regional languages like Breton, Occitan, Basque, and Alsatian for years to enforce its own vision of national unity. Berlin was simply executing the exact same linguistic assimilation strategy on the region that Paris had been using, only in the opposite direction. The emotional fallout from this territorial loss did not settle. A deep, simmering resentment held in France for 44 years. driven by the instruction of politicians to think of the lost territories always, and speak of them never. You can see tangible proof of this national mourning in Paris's Place de la Concorde. This stone statue representing the city of Strasbourg was kept draped in black for decades following the war. The last lesson operates as a permanent historical warning about how expanding states weaponize the village classroom to build empires. It was exactly this unhealed tension that directly fueled the outbreak of the First World War in 1914.